millions of years ago. Giant creatures ruled the earth, beasts with bones like iron, impossible sea monsters, predators so enormous that today they exist only as fossils buried beneath miles of rock. Science calls them dinosaurs, but the strange part is that the Bible seems to describe them, and not as myths, not as symbols, but as real creatures mentioned in detail by God Himself. So the question naturally appears, why would the oldest book in human history talk about beasts that officially no human ever saw? And the deeper you go, the more unsettling everything becomes. Because some believe these creatures did not disappear simply because of a meteor. They believe they belonged to a world before ours, a world that was destroyed. And the Bible may have left hidden clues from the very beginning. There is something strange found in nearly every ancient civilization on Earth. China, Europe, Mesopotamia, South America, Scandinavia. All of them spoke about dragons. Not one dragon, many of them. Gigantic creatures, colossal reptiles, sea serpents, winged beasts, impossible monsters. And the most disturbing part is that cultures separated by entire oceans described creatures that looked shockingly similar. How did that happen? How could they imagine the exact same beings, without contact with each other? Modern explanations say they were simply myths, but there's a problem. Ancient accounts do not describe dragons as fantasy. They describe them as real animals, feared creatures, hunted creatures, seen creatures. And then the Book of Job appears, one of the oldest texts in the entire Bible. And there, God personally describes two creatures that do not match any modern animal: Behemoth and Leviathan. Two names that have puzzled theologians for centuries, because the more you read their descriptions, the less they sound like metaphors, and the more they sound like memories. In Job chapter 40, God speaks directly to Job from the whirlwind, and suddenly he mentions something strange. Behold now Behemoth, which I made with you. But then the description changes completely. His bones are like bars of bronze, his limbs like rods of iron, his tail moves like a cedar. Stop there for a second. A cedar, not a branch, not a rope, not something small, a massive tree. For years, some tried to claim Behemoth was a hippopotamus, but there's a huge problem. Hippos have tiny tails, nothing remotely similar to a cedar tree. So, why would God use that comparison? And this is where the theory becomes uncomfortable, because there is a creature whose anatomy matches the description in a disturbing way. Sauropods, massive herbivorous dinosaurs, endless necks, monumental bodies, and gigantic tails, like living trees. And suddenly the entire scene changes. Imagine Job hearing that description. Imagine an ancient humanity that still preserved oral memories of gigantic creatures. Because the Bible never presents Behemoth as a legend. It presents him as part of God's creation. Real, physical, overwhelming. And Behemoth is not even the most terrifying creature in the story, because then something even worse appears. Something that lives in the ocean. Something that makes Behemoth seem almost harmless. Leviathan. Job 41 is one of the strangest chapters in the entire Bible, because God begins describing a sea creature, so terrifying that no man could control it. Listen to this. Out of his mouth go burning lamps, smoke comes out of his nostrils, his breath kindles coals. That does not sound like a crocodile. It does not sound like a whale. It does not sound like anything alive today. And this is where the debate explodes, because some believe Leviathan was simply poetic language. But others ask an uncomfortable question. Why would God exaggerate a creature if the entire point of the speech was to demonstrate his real power over creation? The text even describes sealed scales, unimaginable strength, near invulnerability, absolute terror. Leviathan does not sound symbolic. It sounds like a predator, And the strangest part is that modern animals already exist that produce extreme chemical reactions. The bombardier beetle, for example, expels boiling liquid through an internal chemical reaction. Now imagine something similar on a monstrous scale. Suddenly, the description no longer sounds entirely impossible. And then something even stranger appears. The word Leviathan shows up multiple times throughout the Bible, always connected to chaos, the deep ocean, impossible creatures, as if the memory of that beast had been burned into humanity's collective memory for centuries. But then comes the most dangerous question of all. If these creatures were real, when did they live? And the answer may connect directly to the greatest mystery in Genesis. Most people assume the biblical story begins with Adam, but Genesis contains a strange problem. Verse 1 says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, perfect, ordered, complete. But immediately afterward, the earth was without form and void. Chaos, darkness, the abyss." What happened between those two verses? Why does a perfect creation suddenly appear destroyed? This is where one of the most controversial theories in theology begins. The gap theory. The idea that between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 there exists an enormous span of time, possibly millions of years. An entire world existed before Adam, and some believe that world ended under judgment. What makes this disturbing is that paleontology also speaks of a destroyed world, a planet filled with colossal creatures that vanished suddenly. The Cretaceous mass extinction, 75% of all life erased almost instantly. And now the connection starts becoming strange, because the Bible also speaks about a rebellion before mankind, the fall of Lucifer, an event so devastating that according to some interpretations, it affected even the earth itself, and suddenly certain pieces begin fitting together in disturbing ways. An ancient world, gigantic creatures, sudden chaos, darkness, destruction, and then restoration. As if Genesis chapter 1 does not describe the first creation, but the reconstruction of something lost. Maybe that is why so many ancient cultures spoke about dragons. Maybe they were not inventing monsters. Maybe they were remembering something. Because ancient humanity discovered gigantic bones long before modern science existed. Imagine finding a dinosaur skull 3,000 years ago, without paleontology, without museums, without evolution. What would you think? Probably exactly what they thought. Dragons, ancient beasts, creatures from another age. And maybe that is why the book of Job feels so unsettling. Because it does not read like medieval fantasy. It reads as if those creatures were still known, as if the memory had not completely vanished yet. And then you realize something incredible. The Bible never tried to explain dinosaurs. It simply mentions them as part of a world that may not have seemed mysterious at all to its original authors. Maybe Behemoth was not a dinosaur. Maybe Leviathan did not breathe fire. But the more you analyze the descriptions, the harder it becomes to ignore the similarities. And that leaves one impossible question lingering in your mind. How much knowledge about the ancient world has humanity truly lost? Because while science uncovers fossils, the Bible preserved something different. Memory, the echo of gigantic creatures, buried not only beneath rock, but beneath thousands of years of forgotten history. And maybe the real mystery is not whether dinosaurs appear in the Bible. Maybe the real mystery is why those descriptions were there the entire time, and almost nobody noticed.